Friends, ladies and gentlemen, as Minister Vikramaratne alluded a few minutes ago, there is a need for changing the conceptual framework with which our economies need to be managed and reformed. There is also a need to think very seriously about policy making based on real-time feedback and data. And I'm going to take these two issues up and hopefully try and give you some sort of flavor of how we are both changing our conceptual frameworks in India and how we intend to reform our economies going forward. Now, like many economies, developing countries of the late 20th century, India, for the first 4.5 decades after it became independent, used a very socialist import substitution framework of policy making. And to put it politely, the approach proved to be a disaster. And ultimately, in 1991, the economy faced a very serious crisis and forced India's economy to begin liberalizing. Now, although the economy was opened up and the old socialist policies were stripped away gradually, the conceptual frameworks that had underpinned that way of thinking were not entirely replaced. And one of those meta concepts which underlay many of that period's thinkings was of thinking of the economy as a gigantic machine. Now, why does this matter? It matters because, you see, it affects the way we think about how we manage the economy and reform it. Now, when you build a machine, how do you go about it? What you do basically is to very meticulously create a design, a plan, and then try and implement that plan as meticulously as possible. Now, the problem is that in reality, an economy is not a machine. It's in fact an evolving ecosystem that is continuously buffeted by all kinds of shocks. It can be technological shocks, international developments, political shocks, and so on. And this causes real difficulty in running an economy and trying to reform it by thinking of it like a machine. Now, let me explain this through an analogy. Now, many of you have dogs, and I'm sure you take your dogs out to the park and throw a frisbee and get it to catch the frisbee. Now, most people will just throw the frisbee and their dog will catch a frisbee. But you see, economists will go about it very, very differently. So an economist will first go to the park. He will measure the speed of the wind. He will look at the design of the frisbee. He will do research into the breed of the dog. He will look at his muscles and look at how muscular and strong he is and feed this all into a computable general equilibrium model. Then after running that model for several iterations, he will come up with a forecast. And then, if he's a policymaker, he will then provide this forecast to the Frisbee Policy Committee, who will then give us forward guidance. Now, based on the forward guidance, the economist will take his dog and tie him up to the post at the point at which the frisbee is supposed to land, and then he'll go back to position and throw the frisbee. Now, as you all know, that like the world around it, the park is a complex system. There can be a gust of breeze. There can be a slight difference in the way you throw the frisbee. There may be a scratch on the frisbee. Any of these small differences will cause the frisbee to land significantly different at a significantly different point from where the forecast was. And of course, the dog will not manage to catch the frisbee. And the economists will be entirely surprised by this, and they will form a committee who will submit a report on why the dog failed to catch the frisbee. Now, meanwhile, all other normal people are throwing their frisbees and their dogs are catching the frisbee. Now, how do these non-economist dogs manage to catch the frisbee? The way they do it is that all that they do is the dog watches generally in the direction in which the frisbee is being thrown and then watches the frisbee very, very carefully, and then flexibly runs around it and adjusts its body, keeps watching the frisbee until finally it grabs the frisbee with its mouth. Now, what this system of catching a frisbee is basically the following: a general framework, and then a feedback loop of information, i.e. data, that is continuously used in order to understand how this frisbee is floating and then catching it. Now, how does all of this matter for policy making? Now, in order to understand this, I'm going to first go to an area outside of economic policy to something that is also quite dear to me, which is urban design, to make you understand how policy making would work. Now, whenever you have South Asians asked, how should we plan our cities, which is the best planned city in the world, they will almost always say Singapore. Now, the problem is, Singapore is not at all planned in the way we think it is. So if you have to go back to the 1950s and think of all the great cities that in the world that were planned in the 1950s. But in the 1950s, the idea was that, like economies, cities were machines of living. In fact, this particular quote I'm using is from a gentleman called Le Corbusier, who was very, very popular with urban designers of the 1950s, and he in fact went ahead and in fact designed a city called Chandigarh in India, which Indians are very, very proud of. And at about the same time, other cities around the world were also built: Milton Keynes outside of London, Brasilia, Canberra, and so on. Now, at about the same time, in the mid-60s, Singapore became free. Now, when Singapore became free, it was actually a slum-ridden, poor city. It had been a British naval outpost. It was continuously racked by communal riots. And now that the British were leaving, there were genuine concerns about what the future of this resource-poor, crowded little island was going to be. In fact, the Malaysians were so concerned about its economic future that they actually threw Singapore out of the Federation. So there was Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew with an island with no future. And what he began to do is that he decided to try and build it up using the port facilities that had been left behind by the British to convert Singapore into a light manufacturing and a container shipping terminal. And that policy was so successful that by the 70s, Singapore had become one of the world's largest ports and a major hub for garments, ready-made garments, and other such sectors. And about that same time, they then began to add in a new sector, which was oil refining. And that too succeeded very well. But the problem was that as it succeeded, its wages began to rise, and already by the 1980s, it was no longer a competitive place for low-end manufacturing. So it moved up into electronics. And for the 80s and at least the early 90s, Singapore was known for its electronics. And those of you who will remember going to Singapore in the 80s and 90s will remember going to Mustafa to buy cheap electronics. But by the mid-90s, or late 90s, it was already obvious that Singapore was not going to be very competitive in this field of electronics, and Singapore then repositioned itself as a financial hub. And through much of the 2000s, therefore, it emerged as Asia's leading financial hub. And more recently, it has again re-emerged as a entertainment and education hub, and many of you may be actually sending your kids there to study. Nobody in the 70s would have imagined that they would be sending their kids to study in Singapore, of all places. Now, this is a story of actually tinkering and readjustment. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and his successors did not imagine in the beginning that what they were going to turn Singapore into. What they did is watched what was going on around the world and in their economy and continuously adjusted, rather like the dog that I mentioned in my story. Meanwhile, back in India, the bureaucrats who run Chandigarh are very, very proud that they have stuck to the original plan of the 1950s set out by Le Corbusier. Net result of it is that Chandigarh remains basically a subsidy scheme for civil servants. It is not a city at all. And so this point that I'm making is that real successful policy making is about flexibility and iteration and continuous feedback systems. Now, what does this mean in terms of how we make policy and reforms in a country like India, like Sri Lanka, and many other developing countries? Now, as many of you may be aware, that India has, in the last few weeks, introduced something called the GST. Now, it's one of the biggest tax reform efforts ever attempted in the world. In fact, it is certainly the biggest tax reform effort ever done in Indian history. And by virtue of this, basically, India will have a uniform tax system across the country. Till basically this was done, India didn't have a common market. It was actually easier for Mumbai to trade with London than it was to trade with Delhi, because there were all kinds of multiple tax systems inside the country that made it impossible for us to take advantage of our own internal market. And hopefully, with this reform, we will be able to do that. Now, this is not something that sort of is in innovation. Many people had argued about the importance of an internal market and of GST for a long time. What I'm going to really talk about is how it was actually implemented, which is quite different from what you would think. Now, the received wisdom would have been that the best way to go about this is to create a perfect design and implement it as meticulously as possible. The problem with a complex, evolving country like India, however, is that when you introduce such a massive reform, it is full of unintended consequences. It is full of complications and unknown directions that come about. So there were many people who would have argued that India was not really ready for introducing such a major reform, that we should have delayed it by maybe a year or two, put in place every single nut and bolt, and then have attempted something like this. But despite the fact that there were obviously many shortcomings and concerns, Prime Minister Modi and his team decided to go ahead and implement it on the 1st of July this year. It is not because they do not understand that there aren't complications in doing such a major reform. But you see, when you change to a new thinking process, the approach we took is the following, i.e., create what sounds like basically a reasonable system, introduce it, knowing fully well that it is not perfect, and then have a quick response team to try and fix it as we find the glitches in the system. This is a very different way of going about it than we would have done in the past. In the past, we would have created a 5-year plan, spent 20 years trying to actually plan that 5-year plan, and then try to have this perfect system, and then be entirely surprised by the fact that it didn't work. The approach we now do is put the system in place and continuous feedback and research and quick response to continuously tinker it to make it work. We understand that it is not a perfect system. We will keep adjusting it till it works. And be always open to the point that in some future date, even if it works now, it may not work, and we may have to further tinker to do this. Now, this is a much more messy way of going about it. It certainly doesn't make for great academic papers, but in my view, this is the only way you can actually make policy in an environment where the economy is an evolving, complex system. And I'll give you another example of how this new way of thinking is beginning to influence the way we make policy. Now, the old way of thinking about business failure in India was that either there was some sort of a great moral failure on the part of the businessman, or that somehow, if only we manage to somehow tinker to try and cause a change in the way the company was managed, it would somehow recover. So we had something called the BIFR, which was the Board of Industrial Reconstruction. And the idea was it was about reconstruction. And that policy was used for many, many years. And the idea was basically that if only we managed to get the design right, we would finally manage to get these companies to do well. As a result of which, of course, we managed to keep alive black and white television companies alive for far longer than was absolutely necessary. The new way of thinking about it is that this is an evolving system. It is a system of creative destruction, of feedback. And what it means, therefore, is that we have to be much more prepared for creative destruction. So one of the most important reforms that we have done in the last couple of years is a bankruptcy code and a radically simplified bankruptcy system. The idea here is not to demonize our entrepreneurial class. Far from it. Our view is that an economy based on entrepreneurial system must in fact be prepared for exit. That there'll be continuously new ideas, new entrepreneurship, new ventures, and some part of it will fail. A healthy system must allow these mutations to be continuously cleared out. And again, you can see that this is a conceptual shift to an idea not of intelligent design, but of continuous churn, of creative destruction. And in many ways, this fits with both the philosophical underpinnings of our shared civilization. You see, in both Hinduism and in Buddhism, the world is called Maya. Now, unfortunately, in English, this term Maya is mistranslated as meaning illusory. That's not what it means. The word Maya means impermanent or transient. The world is necessarily seen as transient. Because it is transient, it means, therefore, you need to continuously live in the present and adjust and adapt. So in the long run, this is what kept our civilization alive for thousands of years, because we as a civilization have continuously adapted. The Romans came and went, the British Empire came and went, we are still here. And this idea of continuous adaptation is very much there in Hindu philosophy and our mythology. One of our most sacred gods, most powerful gods, Shiva, is the god both of destruction and of innovation and creation and regeneration. This is not by chance, because this is the idea that continuous tinkering, of adjustment, of continuous creative destruction. With that thought, let me stop. Thank you.